Hello, hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Diversity and Humanity Virtual Summit. I am your host, Kaylee O'Keefe, the founder of Soul Excellence Publishing. And this has just been an incredible experience over the last 2 days to connect with, to learn from, to hear from the authors of the brand new best-selling book, The Diversity in Humanity. And I'm so excited to introduce you, if you haven't already met, if you weren't part of our conversation this morning, to author Reggie Hall. Reggie is a program manager for an F-16 avionics company and so much more, as you will hear about. Reggie, welcome to the stage.
Kaylee, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity. As I said this morning, thank you for your vision and your courage. And I'd also just like to say thanks to all the other authors and the opportunity to meet these amazing, heartfelt leaders and all the things that they've shared. I've grown so much in this journey with them, and I'm so proud of what we've put out, what we've come together to share with the world, and then this forum as well, right? So I didn't get a chance to be on all of the talks because of my work commitments, but I've taken notes on almost everyone that I was on, right? So there's all kinds of nuggets. And what I'm really grateful for is that the Lord weaved this all together, right? I mean, I tell people there are 10 different authors, backgrounds, all writing. We didn't know what each other was writing about. And then when you read the book, it all fits together, right? You have high level societal kind of things like I talk about. You have practical, here's how you step by step things. You have personal stories of how what goes on with diversity has impacted people in a negative or positive way. There just seems to be some harmony in our book, which is what we're trying to share with the world, right? So, you know, it's divinity coming together to bring it all in, right? It's the universe making it happen. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk today about my chapter and some other things too. So I just want you to know I feel like this is show and tell, like when I was a kid. So I got visual aids, right? I got all kinds of stuff. I got my book highlighted, which is interesting, and highlighting your own writing, right? So that feels a little weird, right? But I'm not all souped up on myself, but right, you know, I got highlights in my own book and that whole thing. So thank you for the opportunity.
You're so welcome. And I love the way that you sort of described what you saw happen in the book coming together, those three levels. I absolutely saw it too. And I really think it's because we had this shared intention and, you know, we're willing to step into the unknown. And so I'm really excited to hear from you as you share more in your talk today and you describe your origin story. And I'm grateful for our origin story, for meeting you in the AC Marriott in Salt Lake City in September of last year through James Jackson, founder of Utah Black Chamber. And you know, we didn't know how we would collaborate or what would come from that meeting, and just how cool that we've been able to have this experience together. So that's a little of our origin story, and excited to hear more of yours in your conversation.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I'm going to begin at the beginning. In my book, I use that as one of my sub-chapter titles. But I want to take one step back and just talk about the book too, and it's related to diversity and the diversity in me. And we're going to go on a journey. We're going to go all over the place for those who know me, but I'll bring it all back together and weave the golden thread through it. Just stick with me. But I got the book, and first of all, I'm not a reader, right? So when I started to write this book, my wife said, "Why are you writing a book? You hate to read." And I do. And the reason I hate to read, which has to do with my diversity, and I learned this at a late age, is that I never understood when people go to movies and they go, the movie was disappointing. And they say, it's because it wasn't the movie in my head. And I'm going, what are you talking about, right? Because what I've learned over time, and I don't have this human experience, is that when you read, your brain is supposed to create a mental picture of what's going on the words on the page. And so the movie is never as good as what you've created in your mind, right? But for me and my youngest son, the words are just words on the book, on the page. And it's because my left brain and my right brain don't communicate properly, right? The cognitive part and the creative part, the synapses that connect those two things. So it doesn't transmit that picture for me. So when I read See Jane Run, I don't see Jane Run. I just see the word See Jane Run. When I hear the leaves rustled, there's no really leaves rustling in my head. But for everybody else, there is. And so I understood that now. But that's just one element of my diversity, right? The other dynamic of that, interesting enough, is because I'm that way, I'm literally like 50% creative and 50% cognitive. So when you take those Myers-Briggs and all that, they're like, you're like that 1% that's literally split in half, right? Half, half. So I say all that to say, when I got this book, I read it immediately, right? And it's an easy read. I went through the whole book in like 2.5 hours, and I'm about to read it for the third time. So it's an easy, satisfying read. So I say to everyone, if I can read this and I hate to read and I'm reading it for the third time, you should read this. That's for me, that's how good it is. So that's my one plug for the book. So beginning in the beginning, I have my origin story. And I heard you when we were talking in some of the seminar, talking to some of the other authors. Kayla, you asked them, like, why did you write this book? What was your inspiration? And I struggled a bit at first because I had a lot of emotions going on, some anger, right? Some sadness. And so I was like, how can I communicate this in a way that's helpful and positive in the message, in correlation with the message we're trying to share with the world? And so I went back to something that one of my supervisors when I was in the Air Force at the Pentagon said about me, because it's how I approach this topic. And it was an example of great leadership, right? So I had the opportunity, was at the Pentagon, to be selected to be an executive officer for a 3-star general equivalent. And those are traditionally grooming positions. Most people who are generals in the Air Force were in those positions. Everybody in the world knew that, but me. I didn't make general. That's a whole nother story. But when I got selected, as you can imagine, people were like, well, why did Reggie get selected? What's so special about him, right? And my boss, his name was Greg Wilson at the time, said, the thing about Reggie is that he can take a very, very complex thing. He can break it down into small, digestible chunks. He can analyze that, comprehend it, and then tell that in a way that people can understand, right? And I went, one, it's nice when your boss gives you a compliment in public, but two, I think he's right? I mean, that's just the way God wired me up. That's the way I'm made. So I was like, okay, let me look at this from that perspective, right? Because it's, as we've learned in the summit, it's a charged topic. There's all kinds of emotion. People come to it from all kinds of different angles. So how can I, from my perspective, take a look at it and just say, okay, here's what it is. And my key takeaway from today, for my portion of the summit, is this, right? I'm going to say this at the beginning, and hopefully I'll have time to say it at the end. If you take nothing more from what I talk about, we're one. One planet, one place, one people, one purpose. We're one. One humanity, one human race, designed by love, through love, in love, to love and care for one another. That's it. That's what this whole issue boils down to, right? And the diversity that we were created in, the beauty in that diversity, right, is what binds us together. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more. It's a small part of who we are. What we see is not who we are. The majority of who we are, our core, is the invisible portion of us, right? And so what we've allowed ourselves to be tricked into, what we've been deceived into, is the fact that what we see makes up who we are, and that we should distinguish and discriminate and differentiate based on what we see instead of who we are, the core of who we are. So that was my approach, right? And it's all about kind of coming back home. We've heard other folks talk about that. Claudia talked about that, coming to the heart, coming to the core of what humanity is. So with that kind of prism, with that perspective, I took a look at my life, right? Because I'm gonna be 60 in May. Like I said, I'm an older dude now. I'm kind of moving towards that stage in my life progression. And so I look back and I went, what's gone on in the world since Reggie arrived? How has it changed? And how do I feel towards the future? And there was some sadness and concern about where we are now and the future. So I went back and said, okay, well, let's look at where I started. And of course, in my book, I write about, I was born in Dachau, Germany. which was the first Nazi concentration camp. And I mentioned in my book, my father was in the army at the time, so he was stationed there in a garrison nearby. And I told people my mom has a picture in black and white of me holding me underneath the sign. And my dad was in the field when I was born, so she gave birth in a foreign country, not speaking the language by herself, right? And dealt with some of that, right? Because there's some hitsy with the Nazis and Negroes and all of that. And that was years later, but there's still some remnants that I'll talk about later too. And then, as I mentioned in the book, I got a chance to go back, right? Go back when I was older and actually go to the camp. And I say in my book, in my chapter, everyone should do that. It's horrific, right? If you've been to the Holocaust Museum or any of those places, it's a little bit difficult to stomach, right? But it's important to go and see with your own eyes, right? Where I talk about in my chapter, the inhumanity in humanity, right? Because that's one of the dynamics, Kayla, you talked about the duality of humanity, right? The duality that you struggle with, right? And we talked about kind of the inner planes of humanity, and we're capable of both. We're capable of great acts of kindness and sacrifice, and unfortunately, we're capable of some atrocities, right? And so I say in my book that we have to recognize the inhumanity in humanity, and history has shown us the propensity for us to do crimes against humanity, and we have to be careful that we don't let that happen again, right? In our nation, in our country, globally, right? So you have to acknowledge some of the bad to get to the good, right? In the chapter, I say to know where you are, you have to know where you've been and where you're going. And so I speak to that, right? And how it impacted me, and it changed my life, right? There was a real sense of evil when I was in there, and it was palpable, right? And I talk about the silence that screamed, right? Never again. So I started there, Kaylee, and then I moved towards, okay, so that's happened before. We got to be careful it doesn't happen again. Like, what might be some of the causal factors of that? Like, why is that? Why is humanity like that? And as I did some research and from my own experience being in the military, a lot of it has to do with diversity, right? A lot of wars are fought, and conflict is about differences. And so I talk about that, and that I talk about it in terms of this idea of the sickness of self, that I'm a Christian, I believe in creation and all of that. From the beginning, we made decisions and choices, and we can make choices today, right? We can make choices to do good things. We can make choices to do bad things. It's all about choice. We decided to start focusing on our own desires, our own wants, and instead of moving from harmony and communion. The church that I go to is Washington Heights Church. Our pastor is Roy Gruber. I borrowed that sickness of self line from him, but he talks about in the beginning, it was God the Father, God the Holy Spirit, Jesus Christ, and they were all in harmony, right? All loving, serving one another. There was no selfishness. That was hard to even fathom what that was, all wanting to serve and honor the other. And then mankind entered, right? And we had this decision to make, and we chose our own selfish desires. So I talk about going in kind of a seditious slope downward to this whole idea of me rather than we. And then it kind of matriculates to us versus them, right? And countries act very much like people because they're run by people, right? And that becomes the genesis. I mean, wars are fought for other reasons too, money, power, those kinds of things. But when you boil it down, it's they're different than me. I'm better than them. We're better than them. We want what they have, et cetera, et cetera. So that has caused a lot of divisiveness in our world, right? And you have to acknowledge that. And then you have to think about, okay, well, how can I affect that change? Like what's the remedy? What's the cure? And for me, it was, well, let's look at us as humans, right? And who we are and what constitutes our makeup. And surprise, surprise, we're not that much different. So, in the chapters I speak to the Human Genome Project and other research that shows biologically, genetically, we're 99.9% exactly the same. That all human beings are exactly the same. right? But what we've done is we've allowed our diversity to be the distinguishing factor between who we are as human beings and how we interact. So I say that we're living in the dark shadows of a false reality. And that false reality is the fact that we're focused on the differences between us and not the commonalities between us. Right? And instead of being united, we're in conflict with each other. And so I talk about that, right? Those dark shadows and why there's really not any justification for it to be that way, right? That we've been living a lie. I call it the less than is greater than thing, right? Like we focused on the 0.1% of what makes us humans and not the 99 that makes us humans, right? And so then that kind of leads you to this idea of a dichotomy, right? And we talked about earlier this morning, Kaylee, this whole kind of divine dichotomy, which says it's actually our differences that make us the same. And I have a line in my chapter that says, "There's no one else in the world like me, and in that way, I'm like every other person in the world." Right? So our diversity is our commonality. And that's where I came up with diversity is humanity, right? So if we start from that position, there's not a reason why we should have the discord, right? And the discrimination and the things that we've seen and continue to see in our world. So how can we move forward from that? How can we move forward as this whole effort on our book to show harmony and humanity? And I talked earlier about love, right? Made in love, through love, by love, to love, right? And it's not the romantic love, although romantic love is good, right? It's that greater love have no man or woman than they would lay their life down on the line for their fellow man. It's that kind of demonstrated, actionable, what we talked about with Karen and our friendship love, being there for one another. One of the things I say in my chapter is we weren't designed to discriminate and hate. We were designed to lift up, to support, right? To take our diverse skills and talents and abilities and use those to help other human beings. And it's amazing that kind of call to action when we as humans all come together, right? We had DeMar from the Buffalo Bills, basically for football folks who watch that Monday Night Football game in America, basically die for a few minutes on the football field, have a cardiac arrest. And what was really amazing to see is all the outpouring of love and support after that, right? It's almost shocking when we see all of us come together for a cause. But imagine if we did that all the time, right? Because we're capable of it. Like I said, just like we're capable of all the atrocities, we're capable of great acts of kindness and selflessness. So what if we could live in that world, right? We talked earlier about carrying a burden and living in a world where we can't be our true selves, right? Imagine in a world, we live in a world, we didn't have to do that. Now I'll give you an example because people tease me about this, right? I love movies. I go to a lot of movies. And I think part of it is that whole reading thing that I talked to you about. But I go to movies to see reality. I don't go movies to escape reality. And when I'm at the movie, it's like I'm in the movie, right? So I'm feeling what the actors are feeling. I feel like I'm in there. So I'm like one of those people who are like talking to the screen and jumping and crying and all that. So I think the movies are my books. But my point is, what if we create a world where we don't have to escape reality, right? Like the reality that we live in is the goodness. We don't have to try to get away from it, right? And I think by being able to kind of assert that diversity is humanity and start from there, there's an outpouring in terms of how we see and view not only the world, but each other and how we interact with each other. And so I told you I had some show and tell. I had some visuals, right? I brought some stuff with me. And I'm going to start with me just to kind of encapsulate what I've just said, right? And I'm going to show you me, right? So we're all one. I said that. This is me. That's my hand, right? It's brown on one side, but guess what? It's white on the other. And my inside hand doesn't go, I can't stand you, outside hand. And my outside hand doesn't go, oh my gosh, right? It's my hand. It's me. And it works together, and it needs to work together, right? And that's us as humanity. We're all one. So those distinctions, they're a lie, right? We've been living and been told a lie. So if we move forward in that kind of love for humanity and that kind of understanding of ourselves, it's what I think gives us hope and light and the opportunity to create a new vision for the future, moving forward as one united people. Um, I think it was Claudia that in her chapter talked about Bruce Lee and Enter the Dragon and how much she loved and enjoyed that movie. And I'm a big fan of that too. It's on my hit list. And as she was talking, and as I was preparing for my talk, again to try to drive this home, because the back end of my chapter is all about that, right? It's all about love. It's all about oneness. It's all about not being different. I give the example of my good friend Eric Neiman and what he did in that vein, and the fact that he's white. So there's dichotomy in my chapter too, because a portion of it is, hey, there's no race, but then I give examples of race, right? But I do that because that's the world we live in today. So I'm trying to shine a picture for tomorrow. It's like earlier in my chapter, to know where you're going, you have to know where you are, and then how to get there, and paint a picture of, here's an example of a human being, a white man doing diversity diversity is humanity in action, right? In his actions, real, that can have effects. So going back to Enter the Dragon, which if you haven't seen it, please go see it. One of, in my opinion, one of the best movies ever. And it was also part of this diversity conversation because Bruce Lee had to actually go back to Hong Kong to make this movie after he was the Green Hornet as Kato. He was Kato in the Green Hornet. He had this script written, but no one in Hollywood would make the movie because he was an Asian man and they didn't think that he would be a good leading actor. So he literally had to leave the country to go make the movie, which of course was an international blockbuster. And it was great that Claudia said she saw that, down in South America. So go see the movie, number one. That's my recommendation. But two, there's a scene in the movie that I think encapsulates all of this, and then I'll wrap up, Kaylee, with my other two visual aids, right? So there's a scene in the movie where, and it's a dynamic about a lot of things, right? And I've used it, I've done some teaching and I actually use it in teaching. So Bruce Lee is meeting with a British gentleman, and you can tell he's a high executive, and they're talking about some very important things, and they sit down for tea. And it's during the time when Bruce Lee has a teaching session with his student. And he interrupts the briefing abruptly because he sees the student coming and says it's Lau's time. And it's important because he's taken notice of the promise of his commitment to the student and the importance. And I think sometimes we don't do that, right? Which give significance and commitment to people as people and not positions and positions of power, but people, because people have common dignity. So he abruptly leaves, goes and talks to the student. The student's name is Lau, and he says, kick me, right? And there's exchange between them. But what's important about that is that he tells Lau to focus on emotional content, right? Not to kick out of anger, but out of emotional content, which is what this whole journey has been about. Tapping back into our heart, tapping back into our humanity, doing things purposely with emotional content. And so, and he says, with me, right? And so then him and the student kind of spar back and forth, and he says, that's it. And what we're all talking about is that's it. As we said earlier with Karen, that's the goodness, right? That's the sweet spot when we can get there, loving and caring for each other. Excuse me. And then afterwards, he comes back and he says, how did that feel, right? How did that feel? And the student says, let me think, which is what we all get trapped in doing. This humanity is a feeling thing, right? Connection is a feeling thing, not a thinking thing. And so he says, feel, and then he gives an example and he says, it's like a finger pointing to the moon, right? And the student looks at the finger and he admonishes him and says, don't look at the finger or you'll miss all the heavenly glory. And that's what we're missing, right? That's what Claudia was talking about the ability to have heaven on earth today, now, and how we interact. There's so much of what was designed for us to live and enjoy and live to the fullest that we're missing because we've been living in these dark shadows of disillusion about the 0.1 lesser than being greater than. So my other two visual aids. So this is what helps me center myself and remind me to do that. I have this by the side of my bed in the morning when I wake up. And it says, what does the Lord require of you? And there's three things: mercy, justice, and humility, right? So that's a reminder to me every day to try to walk in those steps. And then I also have this one by my bed, and I'll just read it. It says, they may see the good you do as self-serving, continue to do good. They may see your generosity as grandstanding, continue to be generous. They may see your warm and caring nature as a weakness, continue to be warm and caring. When I was in the military, I would tell people, don't mistake my kindness for weakness. It takes great strength to be kind. For you see, in the end, it is between you and God. It never was between you and them anyway. Right. One planet, one place, one people, one purpose. Diversity is humanity. That's all I got, Kaylee.
Well, Reggie, wow. I feel super moved by what you shared here. And I learned some new things about you too. Like just when I thought I knew, a lot, you shared so much more here. And, I love the example as a fellow football fan of Damar Hamlin and just seeing that whole stadium stop in prayer. It did remind us of like what we're actually capable of if we so choose. And as you share, like we can create heaven on earth now. This really has been the message of this entire summit. And I also I loved your use of props too. That really, really spoke to my heart. And wow, I feel super grateful to know you and appreciate you taking the time to share more here in this space. And I do want to invite everyone to read your chapter. I was cracking up thinking that you're one of those in the movie, that's like really in it. Okay.
For sure. My wife's always like, shh. Like, she's like, shh, stop, shh. Like, I can't help it. I'm like leaning forward and the whole thing.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. And, for being obviously a huge influence on this project, as well as we've discussed many times with the title, with the vision. And it has felt like a true co-creation and collaboration as we've gotten to know each other better, as the authors have gotten to know each other. And I thank you too for sharing here and not shying away from your faith, from your Christianity, from your beliefs as well, which I feel like is something when we have this conversation, and especially if it's in the workplace, just isn't really allowed to be expressed. And so I'm also grateful that you're exemplifying that here and feel safe to do so in this space.
Yeah. Thank you for the opportunity. It's all about peace and love, right? At the end of the day, and how we can all be better and lift each other up and move away from that false reality and live in the real reality that we were created to live in.
Well, thank you so much, Reggie. Thank you everyone for attending, for watching on the replay. If you watch on the replay, you can leave comments. They'll go to Reggie if you want to engage in a conversation. And just thank you so much for being here. And if you're joining us for this whole summit, I'll be on at 4:00 in an hour to wrap us up, to share a little bit more of my personal story, and would love to see you all there. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Reggie.
Thank you so much, Kaylee.
All right, we'll see you
soon. Peace and love to everyone. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.